let's bring this meeting to order. I know we're running a little late, so apologize first of all to the witnesses for our late arrival. We had a few votes to go through. So I want to officially start this meeting through Standing Order 1082, the study of the Canadian government's countries of focus for bilateral development and assistance. And before us this afternoon is Save the Children Canada and Marlene Mondaka. Welcome. And Micronutrient Initiative by Mark Friars and Plan International Canada Inc. by Caroline Riseborough. So welcome to the committee. And we'll just go by order as we read them. So I think, Marlene, you're going to start. So I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting Save the Children to appear today. My name is Marlene Mondaka, and I am the Director of International Programs at Save the Children. Save the Children is an organization that places children, boys and girls, and their rights at the center of our actions. Children and their best interest is the central guiding principle of our work. Indeed, our founder, Eglantine Jebb, was integral to the development of the 1923 Declaration of Children's Rights that promoted the concept that children have individual rights. This declaration was adopted by the League of Nations in 1924 and then became the basis of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted by the UN in 1989. Our history, therefore, as an organization working for and with children, both on humanitarian and development programming, extends back almost 100 years and is guided by the principles of the Convention. Given our history and long experience, I am therefore grateful for the opportunity to spend the next few minutes with you to share some of our thoughts, as well as put forward some key principles that can help inform the criteria that you set out when making decisions on the future of Canada's bilateral development assistance. The first principle that I would like to put forward for your consideration is the importance of having our Canadian international assistance take a rights-based approach, putting people, especially girls and boys, at the center of our investments and strategy. The global community has made progress over the last 25 years in moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach to a more rights-based one, which strengthens local governance and empowers citizens, including children. If we are to succeed in our efforts to reach the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, we will have to ensure that international assistance and development reflects rights-based principles, including universality, equity, participation, interdependence, interrelatedness, and accountability. When thinking about girls and boys, we often only view them through the lens of protection. We're conscious of our roles as adults and as parents to protect and provide for them. Children, however, are not mini people with many rights. Children, like adults, have full individual human rights that must be respected. Girls and boys have agency and can, as their personal development permits, communicate their needs, shape their communities and institutions, and be agents of change for their present and future. Children and youth have a right to participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and they must play a pivotal role in developing and implementing solutions to the challenges they face. From our programming experience, we know that when children and youth voices are heard and taken into account, there are tremendous benefits for all stakeholders. Institutions, including schools and local and national governments, become more inclusive and accountable, and children's sense of belonging in their community grows. Through their active engagement, girls and boys experience citizenship building, and they're able to develop skills for creating peaceful, democratic solutions to the issues they face. We are therefore very pleased to see child and youth participation as a continuing development priority. At the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs as they're called, is the principle that no one is left behind and that no goal is met unless it is met for everyone. This is the second principle I would like to put forward for your consideration. Although the Millennium Development Goals helped us to make great strides, we were not able to meet all of our goals, in part because of inequality. Inequality due to gender, but also due to race, ethnicity, or geography, simply where you live. Let me first tackle gender inequality. Girls are still too often denied a voice in the decisions at household, community, and national levels. While progress has been made, gender inequality still permeates all aspects of societies and is a root cause of many barriers to sustainable development around the world. Save the Children believes that it is critical to identify and work to transform the root causes of gender inequality. This requires addressing social norms and institutions which reinforce gender inequity. Working with women, men, girls, boys, community and religious leaders, as well as advocating for and fostering legislation and policies that promote gender equality is central to the work of addressing gender inequality. But tackling gender alone is not sufficient. Race, ethnicity, and geography must also be considered. We know, for example, that 2/3 of families who experience health, nutrition, and education poverty in low and lower middle income countries are headed by a person from a racial or ethnic minority group. Save the Children, in fact, has recently released new research that shows that inequities in life chances among excluded racial and ethnic groups are worsening in the majority of countries for which data is available. As an example, indigenous groups make up 5% of the global population, but 15% of people living in poverty globally. In Peru, a middle-income country, indigenous Quechua children have life chances equivalent to the average for girls and boys in Gambia, one of the poorest countries in the world. In fact, a Quechua child is 1.6 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday and more than twice as likely to be stunted as are children from a Spanish-speaking background. The third principle that I would like to propose for your consideration is that Canada's approach must ensure we focus on the most excluded girls and boys wherever they live. When speaking of fragility in the context of international development, we must acknowledge that it is neither static nor is it defined by borders. Fragility is dynamic. Stable states can become fragile due to conflict or climate crisis. In stable states, there are fragile communities because of structural inequality, most often based on race, ethnicity, gender, or geographic remoteness. While a focus on least developed and fragile states is necessary, Canada's development assistance strategy must also be able to address poor and marginalized populations within countries and fragile contexts within states. This will ensure Canada meets its primary development objectives and those of the Sustainable Development Goals. As previous presenters to this committee have undoubtedly outlined, and as members of this committee know, the geography of poverty has shifted. Poverty is pervasive, not just in low-income countries, but also in middle-income countries. According to the World Bank, more than 70% of the world's poor now live in countries that are middle income. Thus, to reduce poverty and inequality in the world and help the poorest and most vulnerable, in line with Minister Bibeau's mandate, our efforts must now focus not only on poor countries as units of dedicated development interventions, but on people who are marginalized and living in poverty, regardless of where they live. This important shift in analysis would see us focusing on where the poorest and most marginalized are, and ensuring that our international development approach is fit for purpose. It must have the flexibility in design and mechanisms to reach the very people who are most in need, and ensure that they're not left behind. Sound development must be based on need, and there's no question that fragile states and least developed countries should receive the majority of Canada's development assistance. But it should also be noted that in 2013, the OECD reported that almost half of all fragile states were middle income. Flexibility will be important for Canadian development assistance to have the most impact. Finally, in closing, I would like to end with a quote from our founder, Eglantine Jebb, who said, "Humanity owes the child the best it has to give." The Canadian government has an opportunity through this consultation process to invest in development programming that places children and youth, especially the most marginalized, at the center of its interventions, both as key actors and as an affected group, as well as to understand that children and youth's lives and the issues that affect them must be understood as multidimensional. Children living in poverty rarely experience standalone deprivations. Poor health and nutrition, poor quality educational opportunities, early marriage, and few work opportunities usually go hand in hand. Therefore, while funding streams and projects can be siloed and focused on specific thematic areas, the deprivations experienced by girls and boys are overlapping and reinforcing. Integrated programming that seeks to address multiple areas of deprivation can lead to stronger sustainable results in programming. We recommend that Canada therefore continue to develop greater flexibility in funding mechanisms for programs that are designed to address the multiple and unique deprivations that girls and boys face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Monadaka. And Mr. Friars now, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Friars. I'm the Vice President of Programs and Technical Services with the Micronutrient Initiative. Thank you very much for the opportunity to meet with you today. The Micronutrient Initiative is committed to tackling one of the most pressing issues of our time, malnutrition, and particularly the lack of essential vitamins and minerals known as micronutrients. We are an international not-for-profit organization with a global reach, but headquartered here in Canada. For almost 25 years, the Micronutrient Initiative has delivered high-impact programs and new approaches to help accelerate the scale-up of better nutrition globally. Our mission is to ensure the world's most vulnerable people, and especially women and children in developing countries, get access to the nutrition they need to survive and thrive. We help countries design, deliver, and measure integrated, innovative, and long-lasting solutions to correct nutritional deficiencies. Thanks to investments from Canada and other generous donors, we've managed to improve the nutrition of about 500 million people each year in more than 70 countries. Canada's contribution to our vitamin A program alone has helped save an estimated 4 million children's lives worldwide since 1998. We feel that this is a great example of Canada's official development assistance fulfilling its mandate in terms of making a real impact. And today I'd like to talk about the importance of Canada's impact in terms of where Canada works and what Canada does. To begin with, I want to make 5 points about geographic focus for you to consider. First, let me stress the importance of focusing for impact. The Micronutrient Initiative has been able to achieve significant impact for Canada and Canadians by focusing our efforts. So to maximize the impact that Canada can have, our view is that Canada's official development assistance must likewise be focused, whether we're talking about thematic areas or countries of focus. My second point is that poverty is not confined to the poorest countries. I think you've just heard that. Global malnutrition and poverty are very complex. We know that some of the poorest, most vulnerable and malnourished are not just in the poorest countries, but also in lower middle-income countries and middle-income countries. They all need assistance. Thirdly, reaching the vulnerable is absolutely essential. Another consideration for Canada is where and how to achieve the most impact for the most vulnerable people, and especially women and girls. Canada already responds well to calls for international humanitarian assistance wherever it's needed, but development assistance is also important for reducing vulnerability. Canada currently focuses on a fairly well-balanced mix of fragile states and least developed countries, as well as low-income and lower middle-income countries. But within those countries, it's a focus on reducing vulnerability that is important. Fourthly, I'd like to suggest that you invest for the long term to realize real gains. As Canada reconsiders its countries of focus, our own experience is that stable, predictable investment over many years is critical to achieving long-term impact. And it allows the scaling back of investment once local systems have been established and are working well. But in doing so, fifthly, number 5, I would say, maintain flexibility in your funding modalities, because it must be recognized that operating conditions in any given country can change from time to time. The modalities of Canada's investments may therefore need adjusting in line with this. So our conclusion is that return on investment for Canadians is best secured where Canada stays the course. and can influence change for the better over the long term. But of course, impact is not simply about the countries that Canada focuses on. It's more often about the issues that Canada focuses on. Canada is well positioned to lead on some key issues that deliver significant impact globally by acting on them on a multilateral basis, informed, complemented and reinforced by a portfolio of bilateral country investments. One such critical area of focus for Canada is malnutrition. You may be surprised to know that Canada is actually a leader in global nutrition. We have a track record that we can be proud of. Along with the UK, the US and Japan, Canada is one of the world's largest donors to nutrition. According to the Organization of the Economic Cooperation and Development, Canada is the second largest donor to nutrition and contributes the largest proportion of development assistance at 4.8% of any institutional donor. Canada is also among the few countries that bring considerable knowledge and technical expertise to the challenge of global nutrition. It's raised international awareness and invested in action on nutrition. And Canada supports critical nutrition programs that reduce child mortality and improve maternal, newborn and child survival and health. As a country, we could build on this strength with a strategic area of focus on nutrition for women and girls in particular, as a core element of Canada's international development assistance. However, in the recently released International Development Assistance Review discussion document, malnutrition as a critical area of focus is barely referenced. That's unfortunate. I hope that this will change because the stakes are high. Let me give you 6 reasons for that. First of all, malnutrition kills. Almost half of the deaths of children under 5 years of age are nutrition-related. The biggest contributor to global disease burden is as a result of malnutrition. Secondly, malnutrition is one of the most persistent barriers to improved human development. A child who gets good nutrition before turning 2 years of age completes at least 4 more grades of school and is 33% more likely to escape poverty as an adult than one who doesn't. Thirdly, malnutrition is both a symptom and a cause of gender inequality. It's unacceptable that we live in a world where 1 billion women and girls are held back by malnutrition. Malnutrition categorically limits the capacity of women and girls to grow, learn, earn, and lead. Gender discrimination too often relegates women to the lowest rungs of the economic and social ladder. Making matters worse, in some countries, women and girls eat last and eat least. For myself, I've seen this in Bangladesh, for example, where it's not uncommon for women to spend a long time preparing food for men to eat first. But if there wasn't enough, they and sometimes the children simply miss out. Fourth, malnutrition costs the global economy $3.5 trillion per year. That's US dollars. Nutrition is one of the most cost-effective investments for a healthier, more productive, and more equitable world. Studies have shown that every dollar invested in nutrition yields $16 in return, and that's a pretty good return on investment. Number 5, good nutrition for women and girls is essential to achieving most of the Sustainable Development Goals. From global poverty and gender equality to health, education, economic growth and climate change, nutrition has a role to play. And finally, better nourished people are more resilient to shocks, including the effects of climate change. Well, the good news is that malnutrition is both preventable and treatable, but it requires global leadership. Leadership to make nutrition a top development priority, as it's essential to achieving the Global Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Leadership to ensure that action to improve women and girls' nutrition particularly is scaled up by governments, by donors, by international agencies, civil society and the private sector. And leadership to drive change at a global scale. In conclusion, Canada can build on its leadership in global nutrition by championing nutrition for women and girls particularly, by sustaining its global commitment to financing for global nutrition, and by encouraging global initiatives to scale up nutrition for women and girls by governments, donors, international agencies, civil society organizations, and the private sector. As Canada redefines its role on the global stage, we can leverage our strengths and influence with a strategic focus on ending malnutrition at both country level and in multilateral fora like the G7, the Francophonie, the Commonwealth, Heads of Governments meeting in the World Health Assembly. Canada's strategic leadership on nutrition for women and girls can make a tremendous difference in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Friars. Now we'll go to Plan International Canada, and Ms. Ryborough, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi tout le monde. My name is Caroline Riseborough, and I'm the President and CEO of Plan International Canada. Honourable members of the Standing Committee, thank you for inviting us to testify today on Canada's countries of focus for bilateral development assistance, an important matter to examine in order to maximize Canada's impact on global poverty reduction. Founded in 1937, Plan International is one of the oldest and largest children's development organizations in the world. We work in over 70 countries worldwide to create lasting change for girls and boys and their communities. Everything we do is based on our firm commitment to child rights. And over the years, Plan International has become a global leader in gender equality, working to implement gender transformative programs that target the root causes of inequality. In fact, Plan International is one of the largest INGOs focused on girls' rights in the world. Our Because I'm a Girl campaign that started in 2012 has reached 5 million girls around the world, and our ambition in the 2030 Sustainable Development era is to create a world that values girls and women, promotes their rights, and ends injustice. To do this, Plan International, through its Because I'm a Girl campaign, is driving a global movement that will transform power relations so that girls can thrive everywhere. Today's world is ever-changing, mired in complex conflicts, protracted crises, environmental strains, and unrelenting migration. Borders have become more fluid, and with unprecedented levels of displacement, there is no end in sight. According to UNHCR, there are 60 million people currently that are forcibly displaced worldwide, many of whom are vulnerable women and girls. An entire stateless generation of children born to migrants are unregistered and at risk of long-term exposure to neglect, violence, and exploitation. Fragility, such as recurrent droughts in East Africa, lasts for decades, no longer just years. The selection process for prioritizing geographic focus must take into consideration the changing, complex circumstances and the pressing needs of the most vulnerable people around the globe, and leave no one behind, as agreed upon by nations of the world in establishing the SDGs. We believe that Canadian development assistance must target these challenges to create opportunities for people living with lasting impact. And in our view, the selection of geographic priorities should be about conditions, opportunities, and ability to demonstrate impact for Canadian aid among the most vulnerable populations. In an effort to focus Canada's bilateral development assistance, I would like to share a list of key 4 considerations with you that address the complexities of the global context, build upon Canada's existing strengths and comparative advantages, leverage evidence of what has worked, and allow for deeper impact and influence, particularly on the poorest and most marginalized, like girls and women. The key considerations are as follows: marginalization and vulnerability. As we know, Canada's development assistance is compliant with the Official Development Assistance Accountability Act. A fundamental principle of this act is combating poverty. We agree with our counterparts that regardless of the status of a country, least developed, lower middle income, we need to support the poorest and most marginalized and underserved populations. The evidence is undisputable. Adolescent girls remain the most vulnerable population on the earth. And this includes adolescent girls that are out of school, unaccompanied minors, Indigenous people, ethnic minorities, refugees, and IDPs, as well as populations affected by climate change. With the massive youth bulge in many developing countries, there are opportunities to also create jobs, look for opportunities for economic development, including the creation of green jobs. And in selecting geographic priorities, we need to consider also those who were left behind in the MDG era. In fact, the MDG era mainly focused on those who were relatively better off, and with the SDGs, we have an opportunity to focus now on the most vulnerable. Second is gender equality. As some of my counterparts have pointed out to the committee, Canada has also had tremendous success in advancing gender equality, which we know is essential to reducing poverty. Evidence has demonstrated that intergenerational cycles of poverty can be broken by educating girls. Empowered girls will lift their families, communities, and nations out of poverty. So we must reach girls who are out of school or in unsafe, non-girl-friendly schools, lack basic rights to water and sanitation, lack access to comprehensive sexual health and reproductive health and health services in general, and are at risk of early, forced, and child marriage, are in situations of neglect or exploitation, and especially vulnerable in conflict or emergency situations. It's also not lost, I think, on any of us today that I'm mainly speaking to a committee of men. So I also would suggest that we need to reach boys and men and engage them in the critical issues around human rights, equality, and masculinities that support gender equality. So when selecting countries, regions, or subregions for bilateral or any development assistance for that matter, Canada must consider the willingness and ability to promote and advance the intrinsic rights of women and girls and the protection of the most vulnerable girls, which continue to be adolescent girls. Third is fragility. We welcome the Minister's call for Canada's aid to respond to the need of a new global context, which means that we must overcome the obstacles and seize the opportunities. This means that the selection of geographic priorities for bilateral assistance must respond to the increasing fragility of countries and entire regions. Fourth, a regional and sub-regional approach. Countries in a region or sub-regions face similar challenges and can benefit from regional and sub-regional approaches and investment. It allows the countries to learn from each other and help to deepen Canada's aid impact and regional influence. In our view, there's an opportunity that can be seized when considering geographic focus. For instance, there's many similarities to the issues linked to high child marriage in Southern and East Africa. As such, having a sub-regional program to end child marriage can be highly effective and an efficient way of delivering aid that is cost-effective and produces high impact. In addition to these four considerations, we would also recommend to the committee that there are three other determinants of success. The first determinant is flexibility. When the vast majority of funds available is channeled to countries of focus, our hands are often tied to respond to the needs of people impacted by unpredictable circumstances. This is especially true with respect to the current crises of displaced people who are highly vulnerable but not staying permanently in one country. The second determinant is innovations that can be taken to scale. We must innovate and scale up evidence-based programs through strategic partnerships. We know that ODA is simply not enough to reach the ambitions of the SDGs. And in line with SDG 17, we must not be wary in finding win-win solutions to crowd in critical non-ODA from private sector and other key partners to leverage ODA. We also need to constantly have a view to innovate in terms of finding better ways to do our work and to scale up programs in the field based on local solutions in order to effectively respond to challenges like climate change. This includes harnessing cutting-edge technology in our work on the ground and tracking our results. Innovations which have proven to be effective through evidence must be taken to scale if we wish to reach the ambitions of the SDGs. Then this takes me to the third determinant. In prioritizing the geographic focus, we must focus on monitoring, evaluation, and research to track aid investment, learn from past programming, and build evidence for proven models, and make Canada's investment count on the global stage. This will also enable Canada to create thought leadership and develop niche expertise in specific topics and geographic areas. This evidence is also crucial to carry out effective advocacy and, more importantly, communicate with Canadians about the development issues that they care about. During last month's Women Deliver conference in Copenhagen, I was able to attend a launch on behalf of Plan International, where we have partnered with KPMG and the Gates Foundation to develop an SDG tracker focusing specifically on women and girls, and again, continuing to build monitoring, evaluation, and evidence. So to summarize, four key considerations: vulnerability and marginalization, gender equality, fragility, and regional and sub-regional approaches with critical determinants of success that I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time in front of the committee.
Thank you very much, Ms. Riseborough. Now we'll go straight to questions. I'll go to Mr. Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to split my time with Mr. Clement. Mr. Friars, just a question. In terms of vitamin A, you talked about high impact. So what exactly is the cost of a treatment for vitamin A for individuals in the field that you're treating, and how often does it need to happen?
The cost of vitamin A for children, and this is a preventive measure as well as a treatment measure, is about, the product cost is around 5 cents per child per year. So that part is extremely cost effective. The delivery cost ranges according to the conditions. The more distant the populations, the higher the cost, but it ranges from 25 cents, 50 cents, sometimes up to about $1 per child per year. So very cost effective all round, and usually integrated with other services to get cost efficiencies.
Good. Okay. And what you mentioned that you guys are one of the leading purveyors of micronutrient nutrition. So in terms of vitamin A, where you guys rank in the world? Like, do you do a large percentage of the world's needs then, or where are you at from that?
For vitamin A supplementation, we provide something like 90% of the world's needs.
Okay.
For that particular age group, which are the under 5 preschool children.
Great. So very high impact for a Canadian NGO located right here in Ottawa.
Yes.
One other question before I turn it over then. You talk about partnerships with countries. So what's your thought process in terms of being able to scale back, have the country step up? Does that happen? I realize you're dealing with the poorest and most vulnerable countries. So is there a point in time where you're able to pass the baton to the countries, and how does that happen, and what's the criteria for that?
Yeah, I have actually seen it I've been with the Micronutrient Initiative for about 13 or so years, and I've seen it happen in a couple of cases. The first was Nicaragua, where we had investments early on in the 90s, and they managed to build surveillance systems for nutrition and also the response mechanisms needed for malnutrition, and they're now still implementing them without any support from either us, the American government, or any of the other donors there. So that's a good one. Recently, we've seen Nepal, in spite of the earthquake, do pretty well, and they've brought down a lot of their child mortality rates and some of the other key indicators. So we've decided we no longer need to be there at the same level, so we've withdrawn the level of support because we can see now that they actually are managing things pretty well on their own. So we do, it doesn't happen quickly, but it can happen.
And do you get funding from like USAID or DFID or any of these other places to help enact programs, or is it mostly from the Canadian government?
We have funding from the Department for International Development in the UK, from Irish Aid, we've had it from the Gates Foundation, other private foundations, and a range of other, the Irish government and others. Yeah.
Because they recognize you guys as excellent at what you perfect.
In addition to Canada.
Thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Clement.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Perhaps I could have a discussion with Ms. Riseborough. So according to the stats that I've seen, from 1990 to 2015, the number of people lifted out of poverty is close to 1 billion people, 650 million in China and India. And of those, 900 million went all the way to the middle class. So poverty, 1990, middle class by 2015. So I just wanted your point of view on that. To me, it just makes sense then to keep doing the things that gave to that success, that created that success. Wouldn't we want to do the things that have been working in the past to erase poverty for 1 billion people in one generation? But maybe I'm not seeing the picture the way you do, but maybe you could comment on that.
Mm-hmm. I think the research and evidence has shown that while it's true a number of, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, there still remains a number of very vulnerable groups. And I think if there was ever a critique of the MDGs, is that it helped those who were relatively better off move to the middle class. What it did, though, was it left significant pockets of vulnerability, and that includes adolescent girls, it includes ethnic minorities, it includes children. In fact, millions of women are still excluded from the economy. So I don't think that we can just take the approach that we've previously taken. And in fact, under the SDG framework, our goal is to leave no one behind. So this will mean that we can no longer do business as usual. We have to focus on some of the most vulnerable groups, which will require different approaches.
So if we've got 1 billion more people most of whom are in the middle class in these countries, presumably we want to help them help those who have not been lifted up yet as well. So it's not just our burden, it's actually the burden of people in the host countries. And it strikes me that, I just wanted you to comment on this, but things that help them create transparency and accountability within their own governance structures, crack down on tax evasion, for instance, make sure that if there are hidden assets of the people that are preying on the system, that those assets are released. As another example, trade policy that promotes trade with countries that have a textile industry, these kinds of things. Would you agree that that might be helpful as well?
I think I would go back to what the evidence says, and the evidence says that there still remains extreme groups of vulnerability, which continue to be women and girls. So some of the most effective investments would be things like ensuring girls get a right to education. Currently, almost 65 million girls are still not allowed to go to school. Many of them, 15 million a year, are married off because of poverty and are forced into early and childhood marriages. That will not just be addressed through things like cracking down on tax evasion, quite honestly. So I think it's important that Canada continue to invest in those areas, especially since we've committed to be part of the SDGs, and the SDGs say that we should leave no one behind and focus on the most vulnerable groups. The research is very clear. Adolescent girls remain the most vulnerable group on the face of the earth. And it was Kofi Annan who said, again, the research is indisputable. If we can give girls the access to education, that is the most powerful investment we can make in ensuring that we break the cycle of poverty.
I will go to Mr. Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. Madam Ms. Bora, you touched on the geographic concentration. Can you enhance on that part how the funding should be provided through multilateral organization to have a better impact? If the answer is yes, in which countries and sector is Canada most likely to be able to achieve results from its funding provided?
Sorry, I didn't hear all of the question. I don't know if you could speak up again.
I wanted to enhance in the area of how important the geographic concentration to be applied to international assistance that Canada provides through multilateral organizations. I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be yes. If that's yes, in which countries and sectors is Canada most likely to be able to achieve results from its spending?
Okay. Thank you for repeating. Let me start off by saying I think it's important that obviously we have a number of countries that we focus on, but we can't spread that too thin. In the past, we've had 80-plus focus countries. I think right now between 20 and 25 is likely a strategic investment because it'll allow us to have impact. And again, that impact will be able to take a transformative approach for lasting impact, achieving lasting results. As for funding multilaterals, obviously I think my colleagues would concur because we've had these discussions within the sector that it's important that Canada both make bilateral funding arrangements as well as fund multilaterals, as well as fund Canadian civil society organizations. The reality is a lot of times the multilaterals look to organizations like Plan International and those represented by my colleagues here to actually do the implementation on the ground. So, and oftentimes we are not afforded the the right, let's say, overhead costs to be able to do some of that. So we have to be able to match that with the private donations from Canadians. The reality is under the current environment, we're not seeing private donations grow at all. So it puts more pressure on us if we don't receive a series of funding, both bilaterally as well as from multilaterals. In terms of focus, again, I would say it's important that we focus on vulnerable populations as opposed to a specific theme. But I will say that Canada has led in the area of gender equality. This is a commitment that this government has made. And again, I go back to taking an evidence-based approach, which continues to show that women and girls continue to bear the brunt of poverty. And they also present a significant opportunity because the investment in women and girls has proven to be one of the most effective ways to break the cycle of poverty.
So if I hear it right, from 80 countries you work in, so you're recommending 20 to 25 countries to focus on? Because you touch Africa, one country, but more likely you'd like to work in 20 to 25 countries out of Haiti. Is that what the answer is? Not all 80?
In terms of where we specifically work right now, and we are doing a global review to actually understand, based on the changing nature of our globe, where Plan International should focus. What I am suggesting for Canada's bilateral assistance, I think we've seen it focus on 80-plus countries. It's focused on between 20 to 25. We would recommend a deeper approach of 20 to 25. We also are asking ourselves the same questions as a global INGO.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I assume you're making that comment based on the funding that's available now.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Aubin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci et bienvenue à tous. You can put you here. Because I will ask my question in French. Ma première question va être inspirée des propos préliminaires de Monsieur Fryers. It's okay for you? Merci. Vous avez dit, si mes notes sont exactes, que vous aviez été 500 millions de personnes dans 70 pays, ce qui rend l'adéquation entre 70 pays et les 25 pays ciblés du Canada un peu difficile à faire. On voit bien que c'est beaucoup plus large. Vous avez aussi dit quelque chose qui m'intéressait beaucoup.
You said something else that interested me a lot. I think that Ms. Riceborough, you talked about the importance of flexibility as one of the determinants. So my question is for all three of you. Should we not review our international assistance approach? Because currently we have two possibilities. Either we increase the amount, but still 90% of our aid would be going to target countries, countries of focus, or perhaps in the medium term, could we not transition towards a more thematic approach rather than a country of focus approach?
Thank you very much. I hope I understood most of the question. Forgive me if I
problem.
reply in English. I think if I understand the question correctly, you're looking at the scope in which we've been able to achieve results, which is spread over really quite a large number of countries. That is because we focus on one key issue. You can imagine a long, thin line across the globe where we can provide one or more critical but essential benefits to a very large number of people. This allows Canada to have a significant impact through that kind of multilateral approach. But I would agree with my colleagues here that in order to build systems, you have to go deeper than that in selected countries. And I quite like the number of 25 countries. I think that echoes what I said myself about being there for the long haul and being there for a sustained period in order to make a significant difference. Because as countries go up and down in terms of their ability to build systems and move forward, having a trusted partner who can have a voice that is listened to is pretty critical. So I think the answer to your question, I think, is really one of balance. I think we need the three streams, but the exact, you need flexibility in between them as well, so that you can follow where you're getting the best results with the investment that you're making. And I think in terms of political direction, shall we say, for the international development assistance, it is to give the flexibility to the department to look at that in a very constructive way and focus on delivering the best results for Canadians for the investment they have. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Ms. Roseborough, you want to add?
So what I would say is, yes, I think if we focus on too large a number of countries, then it's very difficult to have sustainable impact. So this is why we're suggesting keeping the current 20 to 25 country approach. That being said, though, under the framework of the SDGs, it's not only a country approach, but really a focus on the populations that are most vulnerable. And again, that could very much be a thematic approach around girls and women, again, going back to the evidence that our ODA could take. The other issue I would say, though, is currently 90% of our funding, bilateral funding, goes towards priority countries. But given the fragility we're seeing around the world, the protracted crises, it may be that we want to increase that percentage, decrease that percentage and increase the percentage of flexibility, just given the nature of what's happening around the world right now in terms of crises becoming more protracted and more reoccurring.
Merci.
Thank you.
To echo my colleagues, because I fully agree with everything they've said. I think it's also about building on the historic strengths of Canada's government's investments in ODA. We have, over the last decade or so, made significant investments and strides on the maternal newborn child health file, for example. It would be a shame to see that thematic focus derailed by decreased investment. I think in order to be able to scale up and to have impact in the long term, you want to kind of stay the course in some thematic areas where we've had that historic investments. But I do think that it is a delicate balance between being geographically focused in order to continue to generate evidence, focus on building and sustaining impact in some of the countries where we've historically worked, as well as recognizing that if we're to reach the most deprived, the most marginalized, we do really need a shift in terms of strategy as well, and that might mean changing some of the modalities or the mechanisms of financing and how we do financing for some of the work that we do.
Thank you. Can I have time for one more? No.
Mr. Sani, please.
Thank you very much for all coming here today. Mr. Fryers, I had a question for you specifically. Being a pharmacist, I'm very intrigued with your organization. And just to lead off with a question, how did you decide which vitamins you were going to concentrate on? Some of them I understand, but if you could kind of give me an understanding of how you chose which specific ones, yep, I'd be interested.
Thank you very much for the question. So which vitamins how do we decide which vitamins to concentrate on? It's really a question of which ones have the most significant mortality and morbidity impacts, and in where do we see a lot of deficiency in populations. So we have worked very closely over the last 20 years with the World Health Organization to characterize populations where there are public health problems relating to vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And we've come out with, you could say, a kind of a top five, a big five, if you like, of vitamin A, zinc, iron, iodine, and folic acid as the top five. But they're not the only ones. We're seeing the importance growing, and frankly, we're learning more from the evidence every day about the different ways in which vitamin D interacts with the system, B12, and these different things. So it's not to rule out the other ones, but we very much go where the biggest impact on mortality and morbidity is seen.
Thank you, because I was going to suggest vitamin B12 and vitamin C also. Yeah. But outside of that, I want to talk about something a little bit more globally minded, because even in Canada, 20, 30 years ago, what we decided to do was we knew that the population was not getting the requisite amount of their daily vitamin intake. So what we did here is we fortified the foods to make sure that in some ways the population got the bare minimum. Now, the question I have is because there was a French company, I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago, that came up with a product called Plumpy Nut.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember.
I do.
And the intriguing thing about that product was that it could provide the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, but you could also fortify it with vitamins.
Correct.
So you'd be killing two birds with one stone. One,
Yes.
you'd be providing food for nutrition, but the micronutrients that were depleted could also be added at the same time. Because I'm sure in an organization like yours, when you're dealing with in different parts of the world, access, delivery might be challenging. So if you could kill two birds with one stone with the nutritional part of it, to serve the malnutrition factor, but also for the nutrient depletion factor, how do you see that? Do you see that part of?
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. The situation we face is complex because some populations, some people do consume food, but it just doesn't contain much nutrition, but it maybe contains some of the other macronutrients that they need. For those, you do need to fortify the foods if you can. So we can fortify condiments like salt, we can fortify wheat flour, maize flour, vegetable oils, all kinds of things, just by adding really a few cents. So for example, the cost of fortifying wheat flour per person per year is about 7 cents. So if they're getting enough quantity of food, you can add nutritional value to it there. So that's one segment of the population. But there's another segment of the population who are simply hungry. They just don't have enough food at all. So the product you're referring to, Plumpy Nut, and in fact we call them the Plumpy family, there are several products, also replace some of the other nutrients in addition to the micronutrients. But the cost is very different. So the cost per child per year for Plumpy Nut is around $50 per year. So you can see the cost differential. So if you were trying to serve the needs, there's 180 million in Africa alone, children in need. So that's an awful lot of emergency and therapeutic feeding that you would do for that population. Now, if you can mobilize the resources, that's great. But we're actually looking for the right solutions for the different treated as a market almost, different segments of the market that have slightly different needs.
Thank you very much for mentioning the cost, because for me, looking at the ingredients, I know that there has been some patent issues with that product because have been other countries and other companies that have wanted to make that product. Because $50 to me seems a bit high for what the ingredients in the product are.
Yes.
So what is the challenge of the global community to try to convince the company, try to reduce the price or come up with another competing product that could be done cheaper?
Well, what I can say is that there are a number of efforts, and I believe Canada has been involved with at least one of them, in order to produce locally similar products at a much lower cost. Often local production isn't necessarily cheaper, but depending on volumes and market conditions, it can actually work out more cost efficient. So I know there are several initiatives globally. We have spoken with the officials in the department about at least one of them in 2 countries, Ethiopia and Rwanda, looking to make equivalent products at a much lower cost. Because while this was a very useful product when it first came out, because it met a very, very large need, it's been recognized by the company as well, by the French company as well, that this needs to happen. And they've also entered into licensing arrangements to allow local production at lower costs as well.
Any more time?
Here.
Okay.
We're going to go to a shortened round for the second round. Now we'll go to Mr. Miller.
I thank you all three for coming. You touched briefly on, I think, an important point, which is that Canada has a limited amount of time, money, resources to dedicate to what is probably mankind's greatest challenge, which is eliminating or significantly limiting extreme poverty. One of the frustrations I think we face when we look at the countries that are selected and the countries of focus, for example, you look at West Africa and you go, well, why so much to Mali? Why not enough to Burkina Faso and then Benin? And similarly, very close population numbers. Obviously, poverty doesn't stop at customs. So the question then is, what do you do with limited resources, limited involvement, speciality, and frankly, engagement in these countries? And you mentioned, so when you transition to thematic approaches, the issue then is, where can Canada contribute its expertise? So that is essentially my question to you, Mr. Fries. You mentioned nutrition. Mr. Riseborough, you mentioned the role of women championing that issue. There's championing water issues, all sorts of things where Canada can be a leader. What is your view on perhaps those three issues and perhaps and more that I'm missing?
I would start off by saying we have to take an approach that is holistic. So while obviously nutrition is a very important issue, it cannot be done in isolation. If you have children that survive the age of 5 but don't have access to school, then we're not helping them break the cycle of poverty. If they don't have access to rights and they survive 5, but then they're being married off at 12 years old and having their first child at 13 and likely dying in childbirth, that is not success. So I think, again, this is why having 20 to 25 countries of focus where we can intervene and provide assistance that takes a holistic approach will be important. We all realize that we don't have enough money, though, to solve all of the world's issues. And so I think, again, this is where we have a unique opportunity under the SDG framework to leverage public-private partnerships and leverage ODA along with non-ODA contributions. At Plan International, we're continuing to work on a number of innovations that bring together public and private resources to be able to amplify our impact. More recently around green technology in Kenya, where we've partnered with the largest solar provider, who is also a Canadian company, to be able to reduce energy poverty and provide opportunities for green jobs, particularly for women and girls. So I think, again, this is where private-public partnerships can have significant opportunity.
Thank you very much. So part of the question of what to do with limited resources, I think I'm taken with the suggestion that Caroline made about also looking at regions and sub-regions. And you mentioned Burkina Faso, Mali, these countries in French West Africa. One of the things we do is actually to say, well, we have a Sahel-based approach. So we're looking at a small basket of the really relatively small countries and looking at the investment across those, because the opportunity, particularly in the African continent and particularly in West Africa, is that there are economic groupings of countries. So it is possible to work with UEMOA, which is the Francophone agglomeration, and ECOWAS, and we've done that quite successfully. So these I think, are opportunities which are like sort of halfway multilateral, halfway bilateral, and allow Canada to intervene in perhaps a more flexible way according to the circumstances. And also, just to pick up on something perhaps I should explain about nutrition, that while we focus on nutrition, it is nutrition within the systems in the country. It's not nutrition as a sort of standalone thing. The problem that we face is that if you look in our provincial governments, for example, in Canada, you'll see a Ministry of Education, something to do with roads and water. You don't find ministries of nutrition. They don't exist. So nutrition has to be integrated in a holistic way, as described. So we need girls and women empowered and with a rights-based approach to be able to decide on their dietary intake, for example. Whether they're informed and able to do that, their nutrition can improve. So just to paint a picture of nutrition as something critical that must be integrated within a larger framework of social support. I hope that's some of the answers to your questions, but perhaps I missed one part of it.
No, it's helpful. And Ms. Wandaka, if you
Again, coming in last, my colleagues here really cover a lot of what I would say. I guess in terms of dealing with the issue of limited resources that you've highlighted in your question and the issue of thematic approaches, I think definitely leveraging, private-public partnerships, I think, is key to, being able to create greater resources to address, the multiple issues that we deal with. Being able to have the opportunity to work with others is key. I also think, engaging with local and national governments is also a critical component of the work that we do, and critical to any kind of sustainability. Highlight one example, we've been working in Colombia, Save the Children, for a number of years with bilateral programming. And we're in an area of the country, in the northwest area of Colombia, where it's a conflict-affected area, working with ethnic and Afro-Colombian minorities. And we're working to really transform their education. In order to do that, Save the Children alone cannot do that. We have to work very closely with local educational authorities, who in turn allow us to work very directly with the schools, principals, teachers, to really change the way that education is delivered to young kids, so that in fact it is not just an issue of access, but it's an issue of quality. In order for that program to be sustainable, to really have had impact, you really need to be able to engage with local actors, whether they be at the community level or at the government level. That's the ultimate goal, I think, of all of organizations like ours, where we want governments to be able to ultimately deliver on their responsibilities to children and youth in the case of Save the Children.
Thank you, colleagues. We'll have to wrap it up there. And thank our witnesses very much, short as it was. We appreciate your information, obviously, and advice. And if there's anything else that you can think of that we didn't get a chance to talk about, please feel free to write us and let us know. And this is a very important subject to us, so we very much appreciate your time. Colleagues, we'll take a 5-minute suspension, and we'll go on with the next group of witnesses. Thank you. Colleagues, will bring this meeting back to order. And in front of us, we have a number of academics, which I always enjoy meeting because they're more freewheeling, and I get way more enjoyment out of it, I have to admit. So I want to start to my left and have you introduce yourselves, and we'll get right into this and hopefully get some dialogue going. So.
Good afternoon. My name is Aniket Bhushan. I am an adjunct research professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. I also lead a data and analytics platform at the university called the Canadian International Development Platform. And I thank you for your time. Are we just doing introductions and coming back?
Yes,
okay.
And then we'll come back to you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Hi there, Shannon Kinnernay. I'm an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. I also happen to work with Aniket, and I'm also an independent consultant. Prior to this, I was with the North-South Institute, which many of you may remember, for about 5 years.
My name is Benjamin Zala. I'm a professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also co-directing the Failed States Research Network with the Center of International, what's it called? CIPS, International Policy Studies.
Thank you. Professor Bhushan, you'll start, and then we'll just go across the road and for your opening comments, and then we'll get right into questions from there.
Sure.
Please.
Okay, so I should preface my remarks by saying that we have also submitted a lengthier version of the remarks. I'm coming from the background of a sort of a data person and an analytics person, so you might find that pervades some of my remarks here as well. So that is there for you as a resource to have at your discretion. What I'd like to do is really situate what I'm going to say in two segments. First, the challenge, and second, the recommendations. What should Canada do if you accept my proposition in terms of the challenge? So the first thing I think one may even be worth asking is, do we even really need such a thing as a country of focus list, a prioritization list? So much of assistance now is responsive. So much of what we finance is due to emergencies, which are inherently unpredictable. You know, do we really need such a prioritization framework? I would argue that a disciplined commitment to long-term development, especially when budgets are stretched, because we have emergencies, because we have humanitarian situations that take up so much of the resource need, is precisely the reason why prioritization is important, and is precisely the reason to think about the countries of focus list. So what is the problem with the current approach? So the current approach, to summarize, is based on a threefold formula. Need, the country's need, ability to benefit from Canadian assistance, ability to benefit from assistance overall, and alignment with Canadian foreign policy. So what is the problem with this approach? Well, it has been argued, and I agree with the fact that this is a way too broad and too vague an approach. It leads us to a place where we have 37 in all priorities and partners, so focus and partner countries. There's a lack of transparency about how the approach is actually applied. So really any country you can think of can be put into a focus or a partner list because the criteria are so broad. And the rationale for how this links to 90% of our bilateral budget, which is actually even contestable whether it is 90% of the bilateral budget, there is no sense of a hard analysis. There is no costed sense of objectives in linking priorities and resources. I would argue for some other reasons there are problems with this approach. So what I call the macro level contextual changes, others have talked about this as well. Let me just go through them very quickly. One, global agendas are getting broader and broader. So they have a tendency to want to make us go wider and thinner. The best case in point is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, agreed last year at the UN. The COP process, climate change, is another one as an example of agendas getting broader and bigger and demanding more resources. Two, the rules of what counts as official development assistance are changing, and we can get into this more in the Q&A. Three, diplomacy and geostrategic interests can have an impact on broadening and going too wide and too thin. An example of that is linking the idea of our aid allocation and our resource needs in terms of our aid budget to, for instance, winning a seat at the UN Security Council. A very bad idea to link those two things together. It's easy, I would argue, to say that we want to focus on the poorest and fragile states. But consider this fact. Since 2000, the number of LICs, low-income countries, has more than halved. So we had 63 low-income countries. We now have about 31 low-income countries. So the number of countries in that category is halved. Halving extreme poverty was also achieved ahead of the Millennium Development Goal target, as others have also pointed out. So in my view, country-level analysis may be insufficient in the situation that we find ourselves. The best projections point to the fact that global extreme poverty will be increasingly concentrated in a small number of very fragile contexts, I would say contexts and not states, and in hard-to-reach pockets of deep and persistent poverty in large middle-income countries. So this is all something that you all have heard. In the SDGs, there is also a new framing of our level of ambition, which is to end extreme poverty by 2030. So that is, leave no one behind, and it also means that it is beset with a new problem and a new challenge, which is what I call the last mile problem. The closer you get to zero, the harder it is to reach zero. So this is the context within which I'm sort of situating the challenges we face. So I've done a quick analysis of our current sort of lists or our current focus, and I'll go through this very quickly, and I hope you can ask me about it in the Q&A, and a lot of the data is there for you to refer to. So I want to point to what our analysis shows as 8 generalizable characteristics across our current focus and partner countries. So these are rapid population growth, rapid urbanization, serious social and economic hard infrastructure deficits, youth bulge, serious challenges surrounding gender issues, gender rights, equality, vulnerability to climate change, limited state capacity and fragility, endemic corruption, and governance challenges. In addition to this, our analysis takes into account a set of factors to essentially see how good at prioritization the framework is. So we take into account fragility, human development, income poverty, non-income poverty and deprivation, and aid dependence. So the summary of that analysis, the complete version of which you have in front of you, is that when I look at that on a quadrant, a 2x2 sort of axis, and I look at where very high poverty is and very persistent poverty is, countries which are also very highly aid dependent, and where Canadian aid is significant, that is more than 5%, for instance, of the total assistance received by that country, I only come up with 4 countries. And these are Haiti, Mozambique, Mali, and South Sudan. In each of these countries, Canada ranks among the top 10 donors. So you have my analysis there for other buckets of countries where I basically similarly do the exercise to situate all our current focus and priority countries. The conclusion of which, let me just get to very quickly, is among the top 10 in Canada is among the top 10 donors in 15 out of the 25 focus countries and only 2 out of the 12 partner countries. This implies that in 20 out of our 37 focus or partner countries, we're not amongst the top 10 donors for that country. If we look at it from the perspective of targeting poverty and targeting fragility, Canada does reasonably well, even with this criteria, insofar as the share of assistance spent in these areas when you compare it relatively to other donors. So why the whole business of a new approach? I would say that because we have a changing global context, because we need a more disciplined and transparent approach, and because a new and fresher approach that is more disciplined and more in line with and takes into account the changing global realities would make Canada a more credible and potentially a more predictable partner on the international stage. So what should we do? So I have really 3 recommendations, and I'll go through these in order. The first, and this echoes what many have said before already, is the need for a long-term approach, but not only long-term, but a clear, transparent, and specific, and I would underscore the word disciplined and serious approach, because I think that is the key gap in the way I see the current approach. So to reinforce a commitment to long-term development means thinking in timeframes of about 5 years in the case of low-income countries, which are not fragile, and at least 10 to 15 years in the context of fragile states. So this means aims should be linked to the timeframes and our resources. we can set, and we should set, clear quantitative targets from the outset that will in turn drive discipline, transparency, and accountability. This means we need to identify and cost key gaps and benchmark then how much Canadian assistance can be spent in meeting those gaps. Development outcomes are, we should remember at the end of the day, for our partners and end beneficiaries in countries, not really for Canada. These are only achievable if we have an equally serious, disciplined, and committed partner on the other end of the table, so to speak. So we should simply refrain from investing in contexts where we can't find such partners. So if this principle were applied, we would get a different list, in my view. Secondly, I argue we need greater focus through a combination of what I call a differentiated approach and an integrated strategy. A differentiated approach is essentially one that is built around the realities that different countries are in. So Bangladesh, for example, is no longer an LIC, a low-income country. Nobody believes that there isn't serious issues there to be tackled, but it's not a low-income country. Bangladesh also benefits in terms of market access to the Canadian market in terms of trade. So Bangladeshi exports into the Canadian market at about 10 times what our aid is to the same country. So it reflects sort of more of a reality of a graduated sense of where countries are by types of relationships. This approach is not new. It's something other donors do. For instance, the Netherlands has a very similar approach. So my suggestion is, taking such an approach, we would get 3 buckets or 3 groups of countries. The first, fragile. The second, low-income, non-fragile. And the third, transitional. And so why this approach fits with an integrated strategy, and what I mean by that is really summed up by the point that development policy in an integrated approach is bigger than just aid policy. So in an integrated approach, we would ensure that concessional and non-concessional resources both are aimed towards development outcomes. We would ensure that we don't only do projects, but we do technical support. We would ensure that there is coherence between our aid policy and trade policy. And if asked, I can give you examples of where we lack that coherence currently. Finally, the third suggestion, in the context of fragile states, I think we need a specific strategy. So fragile states are in a fragile context, and states are really in a unique situation, very context specific, and more importantly, very fluid. So things change faster and more dramatically than we can really account for. Absent a hard-nosed analysis of what we want to achieve and whether it is achievable given the time and the assets that we have to dedicate, investment in fragile states comes at a high opportunity cost. This is not to dissuade from investment in fragile states. It's simply to set more realistic expectations and have a healthy appreciation of timeframes and risks, which make engagement in fragile states quite fundamentally different from engagement elsewhere in the developing world. So let me sum up. Applying my criteria, I get 3 groups, 1 approach for fragile states, a set of non-fragile low-income countries, and a set of transitional partners. If you ask me, what does this mean for the number of countries, I would hazard that for the type of budget we're looking at in terms of the current status quo of, say, $3.5 to $4 billion in bilateral assistance, or about $3.44 billion according to the latest data on development projects specifically, really it's about 12 to 15 countries. In this regard, I should also caution to say that change should not be taken lightly, as it affects partnerships, it affects predictability, it affects credibility, and it has real transaction costs in terms of being able to move and shift strategies. And also simply the fact that most of assistance, as many of you probably already know, is quite path dependent. About 30% of the budget is just simply continuation of projects that are already in flow. So change should be taken very seriously, and I'll leave it at that for my remarks for now.
Okay, thank you. And now on to your next colleague, Ms. Kindor.
Thank you. So thank you, of course, for inviting me to offer my perspective on your timely study. I'm sure that your findings will make a valuable contribution to the ongoing international assistance review policy. I'd like to address two of the proposed questions. One was around how Canada's international assistance can be designed to work in different types of countries, so I will touch in support of what Annikit has said around the integrated differentiated approach. But I'd also like to speak a bit around the question of Agenda 2030 and how we can ensure that our efforts support the implementation. You know, one of the benefits of appearing before this committee following so many excellent contributions is that I'm afforded a chance to both emphasize some points that you've already heard, but also offer you some new perspectives. There has been quite a bit of debate on the question of whether focusing on particular countries has merit in the first place. Some have called for Canada to focus on the poorest, regardless of the countries that they live in, given the changing geography of poverty. Others have noted the lack of evidence around whether the country of focus approach actually leads to more effective aid, but they have of course recognized the logic of the approach. It allows us to have greater resources and as such influence in the countries in which we work, facilitates development of expert knowledge, and has the potential to reduce administrative costs. This may not be enough to ensure aid effectiveness, but it is likely to contribute to it. We have limited resources and we need to choose to spend them wisely to reach scale and impact. I think it's worth, however, further emphasizing that the focus question is not just about our perspective and the role of the donor. It's actually about the burden that's placed on our developing country partners who have to spend a significant amount of time going around and reporting to all the various donors that they engage with. So really, we need to make it worth their while. I do not have a strong opinion on the number of countries Canada should focus on. I think Annikit certainly knows the data much better than I do, and I would encourage you to have a look at the background document that he submitted. I think for me, rather, it's time for Canada to take an approach to international cooperation that's grounded in a recognition of the needs of partner countries and that they have changed significantly, and that it's high time we move beyond aid in terms of how we think about international cooperation. So like Annikit, I would argue that Canada should take a differentiated or integrated approach to international cooperation that articulates our objectives and the modes of cooperation that Canada will use when engaging with different types of countries. You've heard about the Netherlands example in terms of this differentiated approach. You have your aid countries, those for which the main form of engagement is around external assistance, recognizing that these are countries with less capacity and in greater need of external assistance. You have your transitional countries, your low and middle income countries that we would call emerging, and for which cooperation might include other things like trade, investment, and aid working alongside. In the case of the Netherlands, they actually also include another category which they call their trade relationships, which are basically the countries that they promote investment and trade in that are, of course, contributing to benefits in that country. And just for the committee's knowledge, Vietnam and Colombia, as well as Canada, fit in that trade category. So maybe just something for us to think about. I'm not advocating that we, of course, adopt the Netherlands characterization lock, stock, and barrel, but I do think that we need a similar kind of approach. I agree with Annikit. In the case of Canada, we need a separate bucket, if you will, for fragile and conflict-affected states versus those that are not experiencing conflict but have greater government capacity to absorb assistance. The differentiated approach should be rooted in a clear set of criteria that outlines for each type of relationship the rationale for that approach and the countries selected therein. Moreover, there should be clarity on the kinds of tools that we are looking to use when we talk about these different relationships. For example, in aid countries, we might use a mix of traditional forms of assistance, supporting countries to reduce poverty, reach those that are being left behind, and create an improved enabling environment for trade and investment, for example. In transitional countries, Canada might pursue enhanced trade relations, but also make use of the development finance institution that we've been promised. In this context, aid becomes a very strategic input that you're using to target the poor in those countries, of course, but also you're leveraging other forms of finance and supporting your partners to raise domestic resources. Once these relationships are selected, I think you've heard this a number of times, but of course they need to be long-term. As a country transitions from one category to another, perhaps owing to success or setbacks, that doesn't mean that they should be abandoned. Finally, The differentiated approach should work in conjunction with other forms of assistance, something else you've heard. We need to consider how we're working with civil society organizations, multilaterals, regional organizations, and how we're addressing global efforts to realize or address global public goods challenges, for example. I think it's helpful to highlight the merits of this approach for your consideration. First, the differentiated approach moves us beyond a conversation of aid alone to a more sophisticated discussion of how our development, trade, foreign policy, and other priorities intersect. The approach requires us to think about how policy levers can be used to realize mutual benefit for us and for partner countries. The Netherlands approach was the result of a major review that this country underwent to look at how they engage with the world in terms of every domain: agriculture, environment, migration, aid, and so on. If Canada was to take this approach, I would caution that we too need to properly review how our engagement works with the world and avoid jumping to a list of countries based on necessarily our existing list of focus countries or the trade negotiations, though I do agree that there needs to be continuity. We would need to consider, of course, the perspectives of the partner countries themselves. Unfortunately, the International Assistance Review does not sufficiently capture the beyond aid domains for this purpose. Second, such an approach has potential to improve transparency to Canadians and to our partner countries by recognizing our multiple interests and being transparent about them, and clearly articulating a coherent approach to Canada's engagement with the world, one that I think we can expect, or at least should be able to expect, given that we have the joined-up ministry that we do. Third, a differentiated approach allows us to tackle the question of poor countries and poor people, something you've heard a lot about. It means addressing the needs of both. Rather than using strict categories of least developed, fragile, middle income, and so on to determine how we engage, we should look at the many factors in setting out this differentiated approach, one of which would be pockets of poverty. We can make provisions to target poverty in all countries, including those that may end up in any category. I recognize that there are risks to this approach, and many have talked about the need to conserve the Canadian brand, to ensure that our development assistance is guarded from other policy interests. Frankly, I don't buy that this is some kind of zero-sum game. Of course, assistance should be provided according to the ODA Accountability Act, and it should target the poorest. That said, we are missing a world of opportunity if we do not take or are not better at effectively linking our interests across policy domains. We are also doing a disservice to our partners, many of whom feel it's time for this sophisticated discussion. There is always a risk that aid will be used for commercial or security interests. But on the other hand, the differentiated approach is also about the impact for other policy domains. Last November, I visited the Netherlands for a study looking at private sector engagement in development. And I remember when I was speaking to the aid people, they of course talked about the need to bring in trade or commercial interests or working with their own companies in their development assistance. And for them, actually, many highlighted that was a positive in terms of sustainability, and perhaps we can get into that in the Q&A if there's interest. But then when I, of course, spoke to the quote-unquote trade people, they saw it as their remit to be bringing conversations around sustainability and development into the trade negotiations they were having, the conversations they were having with their trading partners, as well as in multilateral fora. The differentiated approach isn't about using aid in the service of other interests. It's about recognizing and working with different objectives to realize mutual benefit and maximize the outcomes of international cooperation for using all of the policy levers in a coordinated way. I'll just like to end with a couple of points about Agenda 2030 and our bilateral assistance programs. I understand that you're very familiar with Agenda 2030. You've heard a number of people speak about the merits of that agenda, so I won't go into that. I wanted to perhaps just flag a few points for us to consider. First is one of the risks that I actually see in terms of how we engage on this agenda. There's a real risk that countries like Canada will reframe what they're doing to fit with the SDGs rather than making any real changes. We saw this with the Millennium Development Goals. I think the risk is greater this time around because the SDGs, as I think you rightly pointed out, Annakit, they cover everything. So we could just keep doing what we're doing and say that we're doing it to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we need to be careful of that, and we need to recognize that the goals do, and the principles of that agenda do suggest that we need to do things differently. Second, our approach to bilateral assistance can be informed by the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. If I take the example of Goal 17, which is on implementation, it includes things like enhancing policy coherence for development, strengthening domestic resource mobilization, and mobilizing additional financial resources for development. These are all things that we could be contributing through a differentiated approach. Another target, which relates to my third and final point, is actually about respecting country space and the need to support countries to take leadership on their own national sustainable development plans. Canada's bilateral assistance needs to align behind our country's national sustainable development plans. For me, this does not mean that Canada should be engaged in every sector, but rather that we should contribute to supporting our partner countries in the sectors that we have the expertise and according to their plans. Our thematic focus is currently wide enough that I'm actually not worried that we would be unable to fit with national priorities in our partner countries. Rather, we should recognize the importance of ensuring that we have the appropriate expertise within government and harnessing from across Canada, and we're able to bring that expertise to the countries that we work in. The bottom line is that supporting the SDGs means supporting country ownership and aligning our assistance efforts as appropriate. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go to Mr. Zyla. Is that how it's pronounced?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I was saying, do you pronounce your last name Zyla?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I didn't realize the acoustic in this room is...
You have to have your earplugs in or it's hard to hear.
And I have to figure this one out. Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, thanks very much for the invitation to appear in front of you today. I appear in front of you today here as a researcher, somebody who works on the security development nexus, and particularly on fragile states, on questions of international peace and security and human security in particular. And obviously, I'm aware of some of the discussions that you've had in the past, some of my colleagues that have appeared on this committee before. So instead of repeating some of the points that they have made, what I thought might be useful for the committee as a whole is to draw out perhaps some of the bigger questions or some of the bigger pictures that, at least to me, lie at the heart of the debate of Canada's development aid and where this aid should be going. And of course, some of the lessons learned, because one of the things that lots of people tend to forget is we've just come out of a huge sort of, let's call it development puzzle, if you wish, which is of course the operation in Afghanistan, which has been ongoing since 2001. So what I thought I will be doing in my 7 minutes or so that are left is to draw on some of those lessons, some of those points that are sticking out for me, and some of those current research projects that I'm engaged in right now. In particular, I will offer some reflections on why states fail in the first place, because most often it is those states or what we call fragile or failed states that are where the largest majority of our development and aid will actually end up, and where we will end up as a country in terms of being engaged politically, militarily, and from a development point of view. In other words, we need to understand the causes of those states' experience fragility in order to help them to get back on their feet, which in turn has implications for where, when, and how Canada spends its development aid. So I will briefly then talk about so what are fragile states, why are they important, why have they popped up, and perhaps some of the pointers of what the literature says of why and how we should deal with them. Second of all, I will talk about, and this will sort of nicely correlate with what my colleagues have been saying, the so-called comprehensive or whole-of-government approach. And last but not least, the so-called terrorism development nexus, and I will come to that in my final point. So first of all, why do states fail, and what do we know why they do fail? Well, let me first start by saying a few things about conflict management in general. Development aid is certainly part of conflict management. That's point number one. Point number two is that conflict management is a full spectrum exercise, which lots of people actually tend to forget. It's not only sort of a sectoral approach. Conflict management is a comprehensive approach in order to overcome situations of fragility. Number three is that Canada obviously is part of this full spectrum exercise. Number four is that, and Canada, again, is in this spectrum, but it's not only in the spectrum, it's also in the spectrum in terms of that conflict management is is a multilateral undertaking. To think of that Canada can do things unilaterally in a sectoral basis or on a geographic basis perhaps needs to be rethought. And finally, fifth, conflict management is a practice that Canada has been involved in over the past, let's say, 15, 20 years through sort of 2 or 3 major international organizations, and that is on the military side, obviously, NATO, and on the sort of political development side, perhaps the UN, and to a lesser extent, the OECD. With that being said, let me take you sort of through a quick ride of sort of why and how fragile states are important. Well, first of all, weak states or fragile states are not a new phenomenon. They have been around for quite some time. If you go and look at the data, some people say they have appeared in the 1940s, but certainly the decolonization period between 1940 and 1970 gave birth to a large number of financially weak, bureaucratically and militarily weak states that were incapable of providing public goods for their citizens. Now, obviously, the term fragile states or even failed states has achieved importance or significance in the context of 9/11, where, of course, an American discourse was imposed on that subject. But so certainly the point is, since 9/11, fragile and failed states have been on the policy agenda and certainly also on the academic agenda. In general, a civil conflict costs the average developing country, roughly speaking, and I'm generalizing here, but roughly speaking, about 30 years of their GDP growth, which is a very significant number if you have developing countries sort of on the map. And countries in protracted crisis can fall over 20 percentage points behind overcoming poverty. So again, this is a significant number. There's also a 0.7% drop in GDP for every neighbor that experiences conflict. So what is a fragile state and why are they important? A state, a definition of a fragile state is a state that is unable to meet its population's expectations or manage changes in those expectations and capacity through a political process. This is the official definition of the OECD. And again, why is this important? It's important because 25% of the global population lives in a fragile or violent state. 90% of the civil wars that occurred between 2001 and 2011 were in countries that had already experienced a civil war within the past 30 years. And roughly 75% of the world's refugees are in neighboring countries of fragile states. Syria, obviously, is a current example. So let me walk you quickly through some of the pointers of what causes a fragile state. The research on fragile state, and certainly the causal factors that sort of lead to states experience fragility, is not only highly debated, it's also very context-specific. Now, while there are numerous what we academics call variables that you can then sort of quantitatively or qualitatively test, that kind of affect this process of state fragility, there's a number of those variables. However, one can sort of dissect a number of those sort of important variables that kind of stick out. And those are, first of all, that low GDP and high levels of political instability increase chances of civil war. Point number two is that extreme poverty and poor social conditions facilitate conflict by providing easily motivated recruits for civil wars due to the often lack of economic alternatives. Third, states experience fragility if there's a lack of control of natural resources. So in other words, if certain parts of society engage in debates of who should not only control those resources, but who should also receive some of the benefits of those resources. And last but not least, so this is obviously summarized under the point of greed. And last but not least, there's a systematic discrimination against certain societal groups that lead to states experiencing conflict. But all those variables are not sufficient for conflict and for states experience fragility. For that, you need the social contract within states to be broken. And the social contract, that is a weak social cohesion and the breakdown of state institutions and the absence of delivery of public goods. In short, we could also say that weak states, that is organizationally, financially, politically weak states, are more likely to experience failure. Now, what obviously contributes to the failure of a social contract? That's kind of at the heart of the question then. Well, first of all, there's weak and corrupt governments. Second of all, there's a failure of states to actually provide security for its people. Third, state institutions discriminate openly and deliberately against particular ethnic, religious, linguistic, and social groups. Fourth, there's a concentration of power in certain parts of society, and other groups in society feel that they've been neglected. And last but not least, there's an unjust distribution of resource wealth. Now, it's also interesting to note that evolving democracies, some of my colleagues have talked about this, evolving democracies are more conflict or war-prone than autocratic states. And why is that so? It's so because there's a contestation for domestic political influence. So, in other words, countries that are transitioning towards becoming a democracy are highly vulnerable. They are highly they should be highly focused in terms of their vulnerability towards lapsing back to conflict and state fragility. Moreover, the odds of a civil war are 5.2 times higher in the first 2 years of state independence, which is something that is often neglected in the discussion. But to be sure, and to drive home the point home very clearly, is that ethnic and religious diversity within a state is not, by in and of itself, a sufficient contribution to cause a state to either lapse into conflict or even to fail. So what's the point here? Why am I drilling on this? The point here is that international interventions, and I would assume development aid as a form of international intervention, should address rebuilding the social contract of fragile and failed states with the following aims. A, obviously, to increase the effectiveness and the accountability of the state, that is to invest in citizens' security, justice, and jobs. 2, foster the development of good and effective local institutions of the state, and often that's been summarized under the heading of state building, that will then in turn help the state to increase its resilience against external shocks. And external shocks or resilience means, of course, the ability to cope with domestic and international changes. And this, some have argued in the literature, is almost more important than poverty reduction in and of itself, or addressing poverty reduction. Third, one should increase the legitimacy and the political governance of the state, that is the rule of law, security sector reform, etc. Fourth, as an intervener, we need to understand the specific historical and political dynamics that are at play on the ground in fragile states. And I submit to you that this is certainly something that we as Canada didn't understand, and we're not the only ones that didn't understand this in the context of Afghanistan. And this is important because, as we experience right now, we need to understand if we want to rebuild this social contract, we need to understand who these groups are and how these social groups interact with one another, how they stand vis-a-vis each other, and what their responsibilities, etc., are. Fifth, we should think of limited economic assistance. And here again, I'm thinking of the case of Afghanistan. What we've essentially created, and Canada is certainly part of this, but it's not the only country, obviously, that has contributed to this problem, is we have created a rentier state that is highly dependent on development aid. It's not able to generate its own capacities. Some have argued that certain types of peace operations need to help internal and external security, and certainly Afghanistan is a case in point. And some have even gone so far to call for a UN trusteeship. I personally wouldn't go that far, but I'm just putting this forward. Now, obviously, in this entire process to rebuild state-society relations, what you need to not only address local elites that obviously have an important role in this process, but you also need to understand the long-term conditions that lie behind states experiencing fragility. So this one, you may ask, well, which one then comes first? Is it security or is it development, or do both come at the same time? The lessons certainly from the 1990s, and here I'm thinking about the Balkans, and certainly our experience in Afghanistan clearly is that we need both at the same time. We cannot just think sort of in stovepipes. We need to think of security and development coming at the same time and addressing these issues at the same time. And this kind of leads me to my second point about the comprehensive approach, or the so-called comprehensive approach, or the whole-of-government approach. And here again, I'm drawing on a project that I'm doing right now, comparing NATO member states' comprehensive approach in Afghanistan since 2001. And certainly one of the important lessons learned from the Afghan operation is that Canada's development, humanitarian and peace and security programming needs to be in line in order to be able to make an impact in a very specific country. What we have seen too often in the past, and again Afghanistan comes to mind, but also in the Balkans in the 1990s, is that each individual department, so here I'm talking about the Department of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs, rather, Department of National Defense, and Canada's development institutions, they seem to work in national stovepipes. What we actually need is an overarching, not only framework, policy framework, we actually need those institutions to work effectively with one another on a particular issue, on a particular fragile or even failed states, to bring the expertise together, because we do have the expertise in the Canadian government. It's a question of organization, it's a question of management. So put differently, departments' work in the individual stovepipes is not the way to go. It's something that we have learned from Afghanistan, but it's something that we haven't really overcome, and that is certainly one of the lessons that we need to address. So at the end of the day, I suggest that leadership is vitally important here. Personalities do matter, and you need people with experience in the public service to provide this sort of overarching managerial framework. And last but not least, I should say that obviously the comprehensive approach, or the so-called whole-of-government approach, is a political process that provides a strategic imperative for any government involved in fragile states. And it is precisely in this context that we observe what my colleague Stephen Brown has called the securitization of development aid that has taken place, that has become a problem, again, in Afghanistan. As some numbers suggest, the financial spending on security-related issues, that is the military, security, police, etc., in Afghanistan was 10 times higher than the money spent on foreign aid. There's also an argument to be made that the securitization of development was more about the security of the donor rather than the recipient country. My third point is the terrorism development nexus. And in the literature, what we've seen is that the terrorism aspect is replacing poverty in that sort of security development nexus. And that means there's a shift in development assistance towards fighting global terrorism. And again, this is something we've seen in the context of Afghanistan. Security becomes a priority over development aspects. Now, contrary to the accepted wisdom in some parts of the public, terrorist organizations, by and large, do not reside in fragile states. And why is that? Well, because even terrorist organizations need a very basic infrastructure to run their organization. So they are, I hate to use the word attractive, but they're certainly sort of driven to fragile states, but not failed states, because again, they need this basic infrastructure. Now, what, if anything, can development aid and development policy in general do to address the terrorism problem? And I will put forward 4 or 5 points to you in the question and answer period.
That's better. Thank you very much. I know you professors are used to the hour lecture, so I will give you a 10-second lecture. Your time is up. Let's go right to questions, and I'll go to Mr. Kent, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. In the interest of time constraints, I'll limit myself to one question. It is to Professor Zyla, and it is continuing along the lines of the terrorism development nexus, because development has always been challenged in conflict and post-conflict, post-disaster, fragile states with political vacuums, governance vacuums, corruption, and so forth. But you began to describe the new phenomenon of Al-Qaeda type terrorism and its variants and its replicants. ISIS, we're seeing now copycats coming up in different parts of the world claiming to be associated. Perhaps they are, we don't know. And we're seeing in states, Libya is now, Libya, South Sudan, Congo, there are now not simply domestic national terror organizations, but there are those that are following the ideological or non-ideological lead of other more successful terrorist groups in other parts of the world. We're almost getting into hemispheric cross-pollination. I'm just wondering, what is your conclusion or what is your prediction in terms of how that is going to even further impact on the share of the big development aid envelope? In other words, is every program susceptible to this new and spreading terror phenomenon?
Well, thanks very much for the question. I think the problem is not going to go away anytime soon. It's not going to go away, and it's certainly sort of spreading in the Middle East. So we've heard some news over the past weeks or so that Libya is now being affected by certain terrorist organizations sort of setting up shop in that country. Whether or not that is true, I have no idea. I'm not privy to that classified information. But I think there's some points to be learned from addressing terrorist organizations, and one of them obviously is the need for a comprehensive approach. We can't just think of development policy addressing this issue and not thinking about foreign affairs, thinking of this, and other branches of government, because obviously it's a whole of government problem. It's a whole of government approach that needs to be taken. One of the things that sort of I've been looking at is that civil society certainly plays a role. Civil society on the ground plays a role. Again, we have to be very careful that we don't sort of replicate the problems that we have created in Afghanistan, whereby we create a rentier state that is dependent on foreign aid coming from outside. We need to think of local civil society taking charge of that, because that will in and of itself increase aspects of legitimacy. It will provide public goods for the citizens. Second of all, we need to think about, and I know this is a very contentious issue, but certainly there is evidence out there that certain types of NGOs, and I'm not generalizing that all NGOs do that or experiencing that, but there's certain types of NGOs that have collaborated with certain types of terrorist organizations. There's evidence out there, and even if you read the report of the Financial Action Task Force that came out, I think, a year ago, 2 years ago, that clearly identifies those organizations and provides about 40 or so recommendations of what to do about them. There's also numerous researchers that have tried to understand the poverty terrorism nexus. So in other words, does an increased level of poverty actually lead to larger occurrences of terrorism? I mean, the answer to that is there clearly is no no link between those. So in other words, just because your country is more poor does not automatically mean that you experience more incidents of terrorism, and the reverse is true as well. Quite to the contrary, actually, some researchers found that countries with higher national incomes actually experience higher amounts of terrorist incidents. What we do see, however, when it comes to fragile states, is the correspondence between sort of states' experience for state fragility and states experiencing situations of natural emergencies. So if you think about earthquakes, if you think about natural disasters, if you think about those kinds of types, there seems to be a strong indication that terrorist organizations have exploited these situations, these experiences to gain momentum, to gain ground in those countries. There's also evidence that FDI, so foreign direct investments, and trade have no direct effect on the reduction of terrorism, which is contrary to what some people believe, but that seems to be where academic research is going in terms of the findings.
Thank you, Mr. Zyla. We'll now go to Mr. Levitt, please. Thank you, Mr. Kent.
I'll limit myself to one question, and so that we can get round the room. And it's going to be on human rights and the dynamic between human rights and our ODA and the countries of focus. We've done some work in the subcommittee on international human rights of late, particularly on Honduras and Myanmar, and some of the challenges, significant human rights challenges that are being faced there. Of course, both of those countries are countries of focus for Canada. I'm wondering if you can maybe, and if you're welcome to take it, give us some perspective on the leveraging of development assistance in trying to achieve better outcomes for human rights, carrots versus sticks, etc., because it's something we're mulling over right now. How to go about bringing these two things together. A country like Myanmar, where, again, we've got a renewed interest, a renewed relationship, democracy is kind of starting, but we're seeing, for example, with the Rohingya population, increasingly difficult human rights situation. In fact, fairly catastrophic human rights situation for them. Thoughts on how we, I mean, it can be those countries in particular, or just in general, how we bring these two kind of things together.
Sorry, I shouldn't be touching that. Let me take a sort of shot at that in terms of maybe a bit of an indirect way. I mean, there's a school of thought out there that, like my colleague is talking about, this idea of sequencing, prioritization, the cart before the horse, what comes first, sort of thing.
Right.
So if you bear with me, I mean, there's potentially a school of thought that says there's one way of looking at human rights in terms of the perspective of violations and the perspective of that sort of very narrow perspective of looking at certain groups and what's happening in certain targeted areas within these contexts. And then there's a broader sense of kind of what is the general broader trend of where these countries and these societies and these populations are going. Is it systemic, in other words, and systematic in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the impeding of various rights, or is it more targeted? I would say that in terms of the sequencing and prioritization, focusing on general approaches that is broad-based economic development, broad-based growth, broad-based inclusive development in a country like Burma, Myanmar, will take it on a path where a lot of these situations where directly there's going to be very limited amount that we can do without getting into very contentious waters very quickly. And if you take my premise of, do we really have the partners to be able to engage with that problem in that situation in a way that we can do something about it, in a targeted manner and in an isolated manner? If you take that premise, you're better off investing, if I were controlling the portfolio, at a more aggregate level in looking at ensuring that the country generally is moving in a direction that is in tune with where we want to see it go, and to have reasonable expectations. To be able to set, the other option would be to set conditionality. right?
Right.
And that's a slippery slope. Because on the one hand, from a government-to-government relationship perspective, you want to be able to support the capacity of this government to be able to get to that stage. So I would say I would tread very cautiously in taking a rights-based approach in that narrow sense.
Anyone else want to have a quick shot at that, or everybody's in agreement?
Perhaps I can put out a think piece. And it goes like this. Development policy and foreign policy in general, depending on what sort of focus you have, is a political decision. The number of countries that need assistance, broadly speaking, is humongous. If you just look at the failed states research index, it lists all those countries, and measures those countries that experience state fragility. And I have the list here in front of me. There's at least 32 or so that you can get involved in various kinds of aspects, whether it's human rights violations, whether it's experiencing certain types of fragility. So at the end of the day, which countries you pick is a political decision. It's a question of where do you want to put your focus as a country, or perhaps as a government. But I suggest to you that the countries that come to mind that perhaps are, I don't want to say more important than other countries. That's kind of a bit awkward to put it, but that's certainly experiencing high fragility and a lot of problems right now are the obvious countries. It's Iraq, it's Syria, it's Sudan, it's Libya, it's Afghanistan, Darfur. We used to have a strong record in Darfur. Now Sudan seems to be fallen, or South Sudan seems to have fallen off the map. I mean, the question of how much do you want to be involved in those countries is at the end of the day a question of how much do you have in your envelope, and the answer is there's never ever going to be enough in a national envelope. So you're going to have to think about strategically whether you do this country by country or region or whatever your framework you pick. Is at the end of the day it's a political decision.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Robert, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being with us. I have two brief questions, and then I'll try to manage the time a little bit. My first question has to do with the differential approach that two speakers talked to us about. So my question is, do the three stages of development constitute obligations? Because the problem that we have with the 25 target countries now is that we can't pull out after we've met our objectives there. Now, if we're accompanying a country through a differential approach through these three stages of development, do we then have the obligation to get to the very last stage of development? And my second question came to me when I was listening to Professor Zyla talk about Afghanistan. Interestingly, when we're part of an armed conflict, generally we do so as part of a multilateral intervention. And then when it comes to international development, we have more of a bilateral approach. So could we not perhaps change that approach to have multilateral aid, where Canada could be a leader in one country, but just simply a partner in another country? Thank you.
I can take the first one on the obligation to see through the different stages. I mean, from my perspective, we're not talking about we're talking about a relationship that has a great breadth and depth. So for me, if you're talking about a long-term relationship, and that's also part of your premise, then it does make sense for a conversation with a country that's done quite well, is moving through the aid stage, if you will, into the transitional stage. There's a lot of logic behind following that path, keeping in mind that the end path is one in which aid isn't the main modality of cooperation at all, if they're at all. And then you would just have a more investment in trade kind of relationship, the way we would think of having with other high-income countries. I mean, that's the point, to a certain extent, of where we're trying to work with countries to get to. So for me, I don't think, I don't know if I would use the word obligation to follow through the stages, but there's a certain logic to doing that. It doesn't mean, that there aren't going to be other considerations that come up, in the 5 to 10 year time period that we are working with these partner countries. But I think there is a lot of logic to kind of seeing that partnership through, especially recognizing that you are increasingly becoming more integrated or more engaged with one another by using different policy levers.
Yeah, so just on that question, I'll go very quickly. I agree with what my colleague already outlined. So part of the rationale in suggesting this differentiated approach is obviously how do you square this dilemma of where poor countries are versus where the poor people are? Because you have such deep-seated pockets of poverty in ostensibly fast-growing, middle-income, emerging economies with space programs and what have you. So that's kind of where this is coming from. So in my view, in suggesting a differentiated approach, it has less to do with this idea of sort of the obligation of being in every stage, and to me, it has more to do with discipline on our end. So what it means is taking a more integrated and taking a more differentiated approach will force us to think in certain ways about our engagement with those various groups of countries. So to give you one vivid example of that, we currently prioritize market access, trade relationships, and aid for trade. We give millions of dollars in our ODA aid money to countries so that they can have better trading relationships and better market access to the Canadian market. Two of the countries that are focus countries currently on our list and that have been important recipients of this type of support are Indonesia and Vietnam. To give you a sense of the lack of coherence, I did an analysis in looking at the data for these countries, and I compared the totality of what we give in aid for trade to these countries, and then what we collect from them by way of import tariffs from the few imports that these countries are competitive in the Canadian import market. We take away more by way of import tariffs than we give in all the aid for trade that we gave to those countries. So my point in talking about a differentiated approach is to focus ourselves and force ourselves and our department to think about a more disciplined way in how we look at engagement in a more holistic manner.
Let's see, go to Mr. Fragascatos for the last question.
Thank you very much to all of you for appearing today. I was glad that you looked at criteria, namely the criteria of the countries of focus approach that has been applied so far. Obviously very problematic in terms of looking at need, capacity, alignment with Canadian policy interests. We've had almost no one appear before the committee who's defended that kind of an approach. And then you pivoted to speak about the Netherlands and defended that as a particular example or model that Canada could look to in terms of how, well, an alternative that exists. I'm very interested in the three types of relationships that the Dutch have with, as part of their development policy. In particular, aid relationships mainly with fragile states. Professor Bouchan, you said in your presentation that fragility can exist in contexts and not necessarily states. Prior to your testimony today, we heard from Save the Children, and what the witness said there was that fragility is not defined by borders. So I just wonder if you could speak about this and whether or not you would counsel a state like Canada to focus on regions. That's what I take when you say context. I take that to mean regions. So if you could comment on that, that would be great. And as a follow-up, trade relationships, the third part of the Dutch aid policy. Let me ask, it's part of the aid policy, is that correct?
It's part of their overall cooperation. So it's not necessarily aid as a tool, but it's about international cooperation, not about development assistance per se.
Okay, so that's what I figured. I just want clarification on that. So just that first question, please.
Okay, so I mean, I think as I've put it in the longer submission, it's by no means to suggest that it's only the Netherlands, right? So it's the UK, it's Norway, it's several other countries that Sweden, thank you, that have recognized the contextual specificity of fragility. Let's not say state or country or context, and the very kind of innate fluid nature of how the situations can change. And what it means is essentially the calculus about how long and how deeply one is prepared to be engaged. As I've laid out, it in terms of timeframes means 10 to 15 years, because it's very easy if you look at some of the stats that our colleague shared to think that you can do something in shorter timeframes. And if you look at what the average timeframe of our engagement in terms of projects is currently, and in terms of our data, in Canadian data, which is comparable with global OECD, is about 3 years. So, it's a wildly different way of looking at it. Now, to your question about whether it's states and countries and their borders, the UK, for instance, has an explicit financial target of spending 50% of its budget. But they very creatively tacked onto that it's not just about fragile states, and it doesn't prescribe to any of these global lists, whether be it the failed states index, be it INCAF, be it the World Bank, but it is their own understanding of fragility, and it also has very explicitly in it the word neighborhood. So it is very much about fragile states and neighborhoods, because it explicitly takes into account the recognition that the borders are very porous in these situations. And so, again, it comes back to this point I was making earlier. The reason why I think we need a dedicated fragile states strategy or a fragile context strategy is to force ourselves to think about what it means and what opportunity costs there may realistically be in engaging in these contexts versus doing development in other contexts. What the payoffs are, what the risks are, and whether we have credible partners to work with.
But we could make the argument that most of the international problems that exist these days, and those that are projected to exist in the future, will be regional in nature and not state-specific. And so I worry that a state-centric approach, and while it is true that states are the basis of the international system, a regional approach might be the best way forward in terms of Canada yielding the best results as far as our development assistance policy goes.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with you. I would, that's kind of more in tune with where, in some ways, in a very broad-based change one could go. But I'm sort of situating this more in the context of how path-dependent things are in terms of where we are. We've always had countries of focus and country-based approaches, number one. And number two, what others do as well. So others, frankly, and I've laid out the French, Australia, Norway, most countries have some sort of a focus list of countries and partners. And at the end of the day, part of development assistance is about dealing with another government, is about dealing with another state, which is confined to a state.
No, I chose to focus on the Dutch example because it was so interesting to me, and you made the case in your presentation as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, that'll wrap it up for today. I want to say that on behalf of the committee, we very much appreciate you coming before us today. I know it's always too short, and there are a lot of questions to ask and answers to get, but I think we've made some progress. So thank you very much. And colleagues, we'll wrap it up. We managed to get our full 2 hours in today, considering the votes. That was commendable. So I'll call this meeting adjourned.